First of all, thank you for joining us for our first in a series of data mesh webinars. My name is Tom Weeks, and I've had the good fortune to advise and participate in data transformation projects since my early days at Business Objects, embarrassed to say 20 years ago. For the last 4 years, I've been here at Ascend as we help greatly simplify what is a long and complex undertaking of creating a modern data platform. The purpose of these webinars is not to explain what mesh is or how to conceptually implement a mesh-driven program. There's plenty of great content out there around that. Instead, we'll talk to leaders like Simon, who use mesh-like concepts as an overarching framework, but at times went off the script based upon the specifics of their organization's goals, its structure, and capabilities. Our focus is to provide you a practical perspective that will help you drive large-scale transformation programs while quickly delivering business outcomes. So before we get into it with Simon, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, we've tried to make this a well-packed and condensed webinar, so time-wise should be about 25 or 30 minutes, so don't tune out during this time. Secondly, if you have any questions, please post in the chat. We'll pick them up at the end if there are any posted. And third, yes, this is being recorded, so you'll have a chance to pick this up later if you were pulled away during the webinar. And lastly, Simon has been having some power issues during the day, so if he fritzes out, we'll hang on for a minute, and hopefully we'll the next 30 minutes will be we won't have any connection breaks. Awesome. So without further ado, joining us today is Simon Smith, the Chief Data Officer at News Corp. Simon's illustrious career covers leading companies such as Accenture, Deloitte, Google, and for the last 11 years in various data leadership roles at News Corp. He is 2 years into implementing a major data transformation across the company, and he's here to share his experience. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thanks, Tom.
And just to kick things off, why don't you give folks a little bit of background on yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think you did it mostly. I've been at News Corp coming on 11 years now, Chief Data Officer. Previously, as you said, at Google and various consulting roles. I think, at college, I studied physics and I was always into the numbers and the maths and the models. And then, like many people, in the late 90s, early 2000s, got a kind of IT job, and but always missed the numbers and the maths. And actually, I guess 10, 12 years ago, data science and big data came along, and it was just something that mixed the tech and the engineering, but also with the numbers and actually like that experimentation, yeah, and that testing and learning and that discipline, but also, and actually think some of the stuff that's probably most important for my job is the storytelling, and so that's actually what I sort of love about working in data, is just it's the confluence of all of those different sort of disciplines, and they're all really important, right? And I'll kind of touch on that when we talk, but it's more than just the tech, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I wondered about that PhD in physics and where
all
of that went to, and it's now very clear to me.
Not a PhD, unfortunately, but master's, yeah.
Master's, sorry. Still way beyond my pay grade. Well, awesome. Thanks so much for the intro. This is going to be some great information that you are so graciously going to pass along. So to get started, one of the things that I'd love to kick off with is to provide folks the context in which you operate at News Corp. This really provides the kind of the sides of the box in which you have to operate. And so can you tee things off, vis-a-vis the News Corp business structure?
Yeah. And, News Corp, I guess itself is not a sort of direct consumer brand, although we own a lot of direct consumer brands. So yeah, absolutely. So, News Corp is a large global media and information services company. We have operations all over the globe, particularly in the US, the UK, where I'm based, and Australia, which is sort of our original heritage. And some of the brands and some of the products we have are some of the most recognizable in the world. So, one of our businesses is Dow Jones, the publisher of the Wall Street Journal. They also have a B2B product, most notably Factiva, which is the largest corpus of licensed news information anywhere in the world. It's a sort of research tool. Our business in the UK operates the Times of London and the Sun, and we have various radio stations and other assets here. We own HarperCollins, the book publisher, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. Realtor.com in the US is our sort of real estate portal, so that business is under our umbrella as well. And in Australia, a wide variety of news publications, but also TV assets and other assets down there. So it's really a lot of different parts of the business. And we always, we always talk about News Corp as being a company that's sort of truly greater than the sum of its parts. And really that's sort of as more true about data than almost anything else, right? Mm-hmm. And so really it's my job as CDO to tell that story through the data. So just expanding on that, our company is, it's essentially 9 business units, which you can think of as really just companies, right? That have historically been really largely independent from each other. And for the most part, they're self-sufficient from a technology, infrastructure, operations, even data perspective. So, globally speaking, we operate multi-cloud architectures in the extreme, right? With some people on AWS and some on GCP, some on Azure, probably one flavor of almost everything you could imagine, right? Yeah, so I think, the essence of my job is in the context of that massively sort of diversified ecosystem of organizations is trying to connect the dots in the center. So it's really very, very aligned with, I think, what Mesh is all about. And I'm not a Mesh expert, but it's really well aligned with some of the principles about actually how do you build out a picture at the center from these autonomous units at the edge.
Yeah, awesome. So within that context, then, what was the event, the compelling event that said, hey, we need to do something different?
Yeah, I think again, it's just about starting to tell that story better at the center and actually starting to do better benchmarking, across the group, like what's working, what isn't working. And again, I've been doing the job a long time, and I think in the early days, there's a lot of focus. I guess from a digital perspective, the real growth areas in our business are around our subscription business, which is largely driven by digital and advertising, which is another sort of very heavily digital thing. And so that's been a big focus for a number of years, and actually bringing all of those numbers together and starting to tell that story, it just becomes more and more important. And I think before we had this sort of central data office, the way that was done was sort of very much sort of based on ad hoc sort of reporting from the edge into the center. Yeah, we might get a spreadsheet shared and that we'd have to sort of pick through. But as the ecosystem becomes more complex, and as you want to slice and dice by different dimensions, it just becomes difficult to scale any kind of manual sort of process like that, right?
Yeah. If I can hop in real quick. This is one of the aspects that has always fascinated me about your specific situation. In that you already have capabilities out at the edge, and in effect, in a way that is, you can think about them in the Mesh terminology as domains, or I might call them mega domains, because they're the encapsulated business units that within them have their own domains. And none of these were plugged into any common anything, right? And so you were in a sense, you can think about you as a central domain that had access to nothing except the spreadsheets, as you mentioned. And that was really the launching of this initiative.
Yeah, and so yeah, I think absolutely. And so really the first, again, this comes back to storytelling. The first thing that we had to do was find a way to automate a lot of that distribution of that information that was previously sort of manual. And starting point for us was, just actually, can we automate the collection of a set of standard metrics or standard KPIs at the center? So this, it sounds easy, right? Because we're not talking about petabytes of data, there's not a big data problem. We're talking about KPIs and metrics, but actually the scale and complexity of the task grows very quickly. So, we have 9 business units, and each of them potentially has a different system of record, or at least they've configured their system of record differently.
Yeah.
And then, then add on another dimension of like line of business, and add on another dimension of the kind of things you want to mention. So then all of us measure. So all of a sudden you end up with tens and tens of thousands of individual pieces of information that you have to pluck out of a system that you don't control. So for example, just looking in sort of digital analytics, everyone has a different analytics tool, or at least they've configured it differently. Customer systems, billing systems, content management systems, ad servers, other paraphernalia around the ad business, not to mention back office functions, finance, HR, etc., and all of these change, right? So we don't own these, we don't control these systems, we don't really get notified, particularly when they change. So quite often they can get updated and we're not really aware of it. So actually the number of interfaces and the sophistication of the business rules that you need to create to manage all of this at the center quickly becomes overwhelming. And on top of that, everything just breaks at different times for different reasons. And it's, like I say, I think people underestimate the complexity of that task because it's not a sort of classic big data problem, but actually we spent years trying to solve this problem. And it's actually it's actually what led us to investing much more heavily in sort of orchestration tools, because you need that intelligence to be able to manage all of those different interfaces. You just can't do it manually, or you can't do it at least writing very heavily sort of procedural code, essentially. So automation's been a big part of making that possible. But then, and the slide's coming up, but then of course it doesn't stop, with KPIs. So really that was sort of phase 1 of, let's actually sort of equip us to be able to do basic trend analysis and tell the story, but do it in an on-demand way rather than having, doing it in a sort of, in an ad hoc way. But of course, if you want to start to unlock deeper analysis, if you want to do AI or machine learning use cases, or if you wanted to create any new sort of data products on top of an aggregate of more fine-grained data, that requires you to have a much more granular access. So for example, in the digital context, clickstream, we're talking clickstream level of browsing behavior. Or in an ads context, we're talking sort of ad impressions and clicks. And that's sort of really where you get to that real big data problem, right? So that's where I think you take the things that you've learned in phase 1 about dealing with thousands of interfaces coming in, and then you just have to take that same complexity from an orchestration perspective, but then you're just layering on all the attendant complexity around just dealing with the huge volumes of data. It's interesting because then, phase 3, so imagine phase 2 is you're sort of pulling everything in the center. So you have a huge orchestration problem, you have a lot of business rules, you're receiving a lot of data that you have no control over. So it's very inefficient, but it's not disruptive really, because we're doing a lot of that sort of plumbing and doing a lot of that work at center. But then there's always, looking for opportunities which tend to be more greenfield, where you can actually, collect once and push back out. And those are harder to achieve organizationally, but they are simpler to achieve sort of technically. Right.
Yeah, and I think we'll touch on that a little bit later, which is a really cool strategy for how to execute a program with some relatively quick successes, something that is so grand like this and large. So I love that. The other thing I'd touch on is if you, I could say if you squint hard, but it's actually not too hard. These are data products in the sense of the mesh for the folks who really follow kind of the details of mesh, especially from the product standpoint. These do correspond to data products themselves. And it does it in a maturity model way, is one way I think about it, which I always suggest that people do, which is there's not a current state and an end state. You've got to define stages in between that are practical, achievable, and can show everybody progress along the way as you're getting to that ultimate state. And here you've got some very, very clear boundaries between these on what these mean. And kind of what those interfaces in the mesh world, kind of the APIs, but what those interfaces really need to look like. So I think it's an outstanding model for people to look at, think about, and use.
All right, great. And I did, we did talk, Tom, about me interjecting some sort of personal thoughts here. I just think I would say, it's very easy as engineers to get really attracted by tackling these big data problems, what we've called sort of phase 2 and 3 here. Like, so many times in my career, I've started big data projects that have taken up time and money and resource and, cognitive bandwidth away from really what I think the essence of a chief data officer's job is, which is to tell the story and to guide the business better. And I think as simple as some of those, that phase 1 KPIs, as simple as that sounds, quite often it can have a much bigger impact on the organization. Just being able to measure simple trends across simple, dimensions, but in a reliable, repeatable way, consistently, is an incredibly powerful thing. And I think, again, sort of just organizationally speaking, and being able to deliver those wins early allows you to get some runs on the board and build some confidence with your stakeholders, which then unlocks bigger investment down the line. So
exactly,
I think a lot of the nuance and the judgment is about knowing when to sort of get the sort of the big data sort of like heavy guns out, and when to actually just do something that works.
Do something practical. Awesome. So here we are. You've described what kind of the sides of the box look like at News Corp, and the kind of approach, the definition, kind of this maturity model of how you wanted to move along in kind of data product land to achieve your objectives.
Yeah.
So 18 months, 24 months ago, where did you first run across mesh or mesh-like concepts, and how did you leverage it in your storytelling?
Yeah, sure. So I think it was probably about 18 months or maybe even 2 years ago where we first sort of started hearing about some of these sort of new architectures. Mesh and Fabric, I think, was around as well. And, for context, we were thinking hard about how we were going to really move beyond KPI reporting and actually start to onboard some of these larger data sets where they are distributed globally and on different cloud platforms. So you don't have the luxury of just moving everything into one central location. Although I do take a slight issue with people who say you don't have to move any data, because I kind of think you do, but we'll come on to that in a minute. And again, and don't want to be too cynical, but as often happens with these new technology trends, there's a lot of really nice architecture slides, and they tell a really compelling story.
You probably use some in your presentations, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, totally. And vendors will tell you how they can sort of teleport your data across time and space and make distributed data look like connected data, just like that, without moving any bytes anywhere, and it's all great. And, it doesn't work really like that, when the rubber hits the road and you actually, actually have to get stuff done. But I think for me, this is where, and I can't remember sort of where I read it, but it was one of the articles I read at the time, I think probably left me with the sort of three, it was one of those light bulb moments where I'm like, okay, now I sort of understand sort of how some of these principles are really important. And I think, again, with all of these new technologies, I think it comes down to principles more than anything else. And so the three principles that I think struck for me, and the things that we sort of tried to reflect in our architecture around, one is interoperability, the second one is flexibility, and the third one is control. And I'll get onto what I mean by control, because I realize that's a little bit of a strange word.
It's a dirty word in many languages. But
control's meant to be a good thing, but
I think your definition is actually fantastic.
But sometimes it's perceived as a bad thing. So yeah. I don't know. So interoperability, flexibility, and control. So interoperability, what I mean by that really is the true ability to interface to any data system in a federated architecture. So, I've received lots of pitches from particularly database vendors. And I think a lot of database vendors are really jumping on the sort of mesh bandwagon, because essentially what they're trying to do is sell you on some of their architectures around sort of being able to do sort of distributed querying across physically separated sort of data sets, right? And but the bottom line and the quid pro quo to achieving that is every database has got to be the same flavor of database. Right? So we can orchestrate this massively complex query across 9 different databases without you ever having to move any of the data to the center. We'll push the query to the edge. Great. It's great, but it requires the same database to be installed in those 9 locations. And just, I think for a lot of organizations, and certainly for us, it's not a realistic proposition. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that, as I mentioned, we have a sort of hybrid cloud strategy. It's not so much the point. I think we have teams who have their own roadmaps, who've invested in building their own architectures, and some of them have been doing their own sort of investments and migrations, and actually turning that on its head and saying, no, actually you can't use BigQuery anymore, you have to use Snowflake, or you can't use Redshift, you have to use BigQuery. It's just not something that really flies in a complex organization like this.
Yeah.
So interoperability has to mean true interoperability, which is talk to anything, anywhere, right? Flexibility is, what I meant by that is having a single architecture, or at least a single platform, that is capable of operating in different modes. So if you think about those phase 1s, 2 and 3 from the other slide, I don't really want to have a separate stack to do all my KPI stuff, and a separate stack to do all my big data stuff. It just means that I just have 2 worlds that are evolving separately, and organizationally I have to have 2 teams that are skilled in different technologies. Operationally, I need to have 2 different operational kind of fabrics. I have had 2 different schedulers, etc. So what I want is as an architecture that's flexible, that allows me to do both sort of in the same box. And in some cases, mix and match, because in some cases, those worlds sort of come together, right? So I can build KPIs from big data, right? So those worlds sort of merge in and out. So in the API world and the KPI world, I might be doing, I might be still getting really weird spreadsheet type data, or I might be doing pandas stuff to do sort of gymnastics, or I might on the data, right? But in the big data world, I might want to sort of get out Spark or BigQuery to chunk that off. But just to be able to sort of orchestrate that under the same umbrella is really useful. I also want the flexibility to be able to deal with, pulling information to the center or pushing information to the edges, so pull models versus pull models. So really what I'm looking for is an architecture that has a sufficiently broad a range of utilities that allows me to do any kind of computational model that I want to. So that's hard because it's like it means that you have, it means that the framework has to be pretty light, but the framework has to give you the guardrails to keep the consistency. And then control, really. And I think, again, this is a broad and maybe slightly ambiguous term, but my meaning for it is I want to have a single pane of glass to be able to see all data movement and data access that's happening across the enterprise. So again, in those three models, right, I want a single place to be able to see from these places, this is what we're getting from each place, this is what we're pushing back, and this is who's accessing what and what it's being used for, what downstream data products are being powered based on that data. And this is not just operationally important, sort of from a hygiene perspective. It's also, we live in an increasingly regulated world, particularly as a large consumer-facing organization. It's not, I think, tenable these days for there to be any backdoors or exceptions to any of this. Everything must be tracked. Yeah. Access control management needs to be spot on. And again, I think coming back to some of those, flexing the mesh sort of theory, the theoretical mesh principles, I would sacrifice a bit of inefficiency in sort of data duplication if I can guarantee some of those principles around access are respected. So this is something that, again, bothers me about some of these. There are databases who will give you row level and column level ACLs, and that will police these things for you, but they just become really difficult to track the settings because it's distributed. Again, you've got settings in my data pipelines, I've got settings in my database. How do you test those things anyway? How do I can't log in and test what someone can see because I will have a different set of permissions than they will have. So those sort of things become really difficult to test, and that kind of keeps me awake at night. So, I would sort of err on the side of, well, look, if it's not too inefficient, why not just have a separate copy of the data? Because then you can lock it down completely.
Right.
So lock down all the sensitive data. No one has access to it, period. A redacted or a summarized data set, separate data asset, but then very clearly, and it's the access, and it's sort of very easy to test. So again, it's just I think it's again with a lot of these architectures, it's like there's good principles, but it's like flexing what actually works in practice. So I guess in summary, I'm not a mesh expert. I think a lot of it's very theoretical. I think there's a lot of activity in the vendor space around it, but those three things were the things that really stuck for me and have worked.
Yeah, and despite you claiming not to be an expert per se, it's it's really, really cool how the, you had some initial stimulus, if you will, in terms of some things that were out in the, in our spheres 18, 24 months ago. But they do arguably align incredibly well with what the current discussion is around mesh, especially if you look at interoperability and flexibility. I would argue those are two of the core characteristics that drive the actual conceptual architecture of mesh and the utility plane, the product experience plane, and the mesh experience plane. And control, as you define it, really is the many of those parts sit squarely in the mesh experience plane. Being able to, the discoverability of resources, the the access to resources. But one important nuance there for me is, as we've talked and you've talked here, is really visibility into the actual movement of data, like and to use the word pipeline, but to be able to actually see what is happening to those data sets along the way. To me, is a nuance. I'm sure someone could debate me on this, but definitely see this as a really fascinating nuance here. But I'm getting a bit ahead of things. Let's get back to the story. At this point, you had a vision for how to drive change. Now, for many folks out there, it becomes like, how do I go sell this now? Like big projects now, to big ambitious projects become less and less attractive. And so what did you do? How did you approach this?
Yeah, well, I think, look, I don't think that there was any challenge in selling the concept of creating a more rounded data asset at the center, right? Yep. I think there's nobody in News Corp who will argue that data is not something you should invest in, and there's no one who will argue that having a view of the our global data is not important. So that's not a kind of sell. I think that the nuance was trying to land on an architecture or an approach that I felt was going to be deliverable. I think, as we were going through looking at some of the architectural options, we did have conversations with a lot of, organizations, particularly around, should we standardize on a particular sort of database technology or a particular sort of cloud technology globally, and sort of build out a truly global sort of single platform. And it's really attractive, and in another organization I'd love to sort of do that, and I think it would be arguably the most efficient sort of way of doing it. But for all those years for all those reasons that I sort of specified earlier, in a significantly complex organization with people with different investment horizons and different investment roadmaps, just going in and just saying, right, everyone moves to X, it is incredibly difficult. Not impossible. Yeah. And we'll talk about some of that stuff later, but but it's really difficult. Yeah. So I think, again, like some of that reading that I was doing around mesh sort of came along at the right time, I think, because it gave us some conceptual guardrails. And I think it, from a technology selection perspective, it sort of changed our perspective onto, actually, this is not a data storage problem. This is an orchestration problem. Yeah. Because if you approach this from a data storage lens, it all becomes about trying to fight the inherent sort of entropy in the data in our organization. Whereas if you sort of put the lens on it of a sort of orchestration problem, it becomes, okay, I know that I have a lot of entropy, but I just need to be able to, understand what it is and be able to influence it, right? And that's what really got us looking at orchestration tools, and that's really what led us to Ascend. And I think finding a tool that gave us that ability to plug into anything and deal with almost any kind of like business logic we want to write was, came along at exactly the right time, and sort of, and at that point it was just a very easy sell, to be honest.
Oh, awesome. I'd love to, I'm just spend a quick minute on this, digging in a bit more. Because at this point, you weren't really necessarily thinking of an architecture within the current mesh framework of a utility plane, data product experience plane, mesh experience plane, et cetera. No. But the way that you were thinking about it, I think applies very well, whether it's Ascend or any other type of data automation technology out there. And so let me quickly go through this, is if we look at the three planes here and look at the state of News Corp as you described it, the sides of the boxes, you have a little bit of everything, multiple clouds, multiple warehouses, multiple databases, each of the domains making their own decisions around the, I want to say, not the infinite number of combinations, but a lot of different combinations of these things. And that's the reality of your situation, and that part wasn't going to change. So if what you did, it sounds like, is you elevated this then to say, hey, how do I look at this orchestration, which I will just bluntly put in the data product experience plane. And with something like Ascend, it creates a single experience, no matter what those underlying utilities are. So you get a single experience and keep that domain optionality. They can stay on what they're on. You don't have any heavy lift to try to move somebody from one thing to another. And at the same time, if we move up, I'll use this notion of it blends with. I know we can spend some time in another conversation, perhaps looking at how you're thinking about this. I'll call it the mesh experience plane, because you have some further ideas on what you want to do there. But at least from an Ascend perspective, it gives you some of those capabilities right away, or in a data automation landscape, whether it's Ascend or not, such that you can see the artifacts, you can inspect them, you have a catalog, you can see what data is moved and where, regardless if it was moving on BQ or it's moving inside a Snowflake or moving through a Spark platform. So you get this nice ability to get started now. But then as you think about layering on something potentially broader and more sophisticated, you have the optionality to do so. Yeah. So that was my 3-minute advertisement on Ascend only, and we'll go back to the story. Awesome. Great. So at this point, you've got the notions of the strategy. You've got a technology platform that you think is going to help you do this and enable each of the domains to keep their optionality. So how did you get started then? How did you think about getting started? And in a way that provided you with some I'd call them quick wins, but way to show progress.
Yeah. Yeah, I think getting started was getting started wasn't that hard, but sort of takes judgment to understand sort of where to scale. But I'll kind of tell the story. So, I mean, look, it started with a really small team. I think 3 of us working on it, and we now have many more people on the team. But I think some of those smart technology choices that we made, particularly around Ascend, just allowed us to start connecting to data, external data sets, and just start onboarding data and developing business logic sort of right away. So it allowed us to forget about having to sort of spend a lot of time at the beginning developing frameworks or complex orchestration or operational boilerplate, and go straight for delivering sort of business value. I think the team, and I'm talking here very much sort of in that KPI phase, right? So really our focus was it was really a laser focus on telling the story, right? We want to be able to be in a position where we can just do standard set of operational KPIs across the entire business reliably every day, every week, every month, and it just works. I think from a team perspective, it was interesting because, it's not actually, again, with some of the tech choices we made, it wasn't an intensely technical undertaking. I think the large part of the nuance was actually having people who understood the data. And I think this is where, again, having smart technology choices allows you to have a really nice hybrid team. So we kind of over-index at the beginning on analysts, right, to call them that. What I mean by that is not someone who's writing Python code or even any code, but someone who understands, if I want to measure, referrals from Google News, this is exactly how I do it.
Yeah.
And someone who has the nuance and the judgment to be able to say that number looks weird, that number looks right. Because again, if you don't have that and you're just writing code, you don't have that checkpoint to understand whether the numbers make sense.
Yeah.
And then I think the challenge then becomes sort of, once you've done that kind of basic sort of operationalizing the sort of metric layer, like I say, heavy accent on analysts as well as engineering, you're then starting to look for opportunities to go further down that maturity roadmap. So you're then saying, okay, am I ready now to start pulling in people's more granular data? That's where it becomes complex in a large organization, because not every operating unit will be at the same level of sophistication as the others, right? So we might have people who've been investing in their big data capabilities for a long time, so they'll be ready and we can sort of move forward with those guys. But you might have others who are not quite ready. So, do we really want to spend the time to pull in all this data if we don't have confidence in the accuracy of the data, because that upstream organization perhaps isn't ready, right? So one of the things that we've been doing is kind of looking across the organization to say, where are we ready to go and where are we blocked, just because either the capability upstream is not mature enough yet, or actually in a lot of cases, again, organizationally, our interface with that team is not as mature and as sophisticated as it needs to be. So we've got 9 different business units on different continents around the world, and you need a really tight relationship with them to be able to do things in, particularly in 2 and 3, where you really get into the very high complexity domains. So actually, I think having a reasonable understanding about how you can make progress is almost more important than anything else. And then I think the other smart thing that you can do is sort of also look for greenfield opportunities. So in our organization, there are a number of domains that have not, just as it happened, there hasn't been a lot of traction, with respect to sort of building out kind of data assets in particular parts of our business, right? And so, actually you kind of can end up, when you draw out one of these maps, you can end up with, oh, it looks, actually, if I look at this business function, there's a gap across the board. That's actually really good for us, because what it allows us to do is it allows us to move to a sort of that phase 3 operation, where instead of actually having 9 different teams build that capability, we can have a conversation with those teams that says, hey, we think this is a good capability for the business, but let's build it once, right? Let's build it once in the center and sort of push it out, right? Yep. So again, I just think probably the biggest takeaway here is just really understanding the complexity of the organization and where you're ready to push, and where you need to do other things before you can sort of push the sophistication level.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about this as well, and where Mesh is understandably silent on this, I would suggest is silent, is is the downsides of pushing things out to your domains or mega domains. In that, if we can hop to the next slide, in that we have to understand that there are haves and have-nots in every organization. People have various levels of commitment, skills, and funding. And I would suggest, as a central leader, one of our core strategies has to be, how do we elevate the entire company? And if our focus is, hey, we're just going to push things out to the edge as fast as we can, the rich are going to get richer, is the way I look at it. And the poor are going to get poorer. And in this greenfield approach, which I love, is what you're doing is you're taking some of these smaller in size, underserved, less capable groups, and you're creating a bigger block there in a very relatively short period of time, and helping to bring the entire organization up to a strong level of capability. I find that a really, really neat approach with what you're doing. Cool. So coming down to the wire here, we are down to the last question here, which is, if someone called you up today, one of your colleagues, and said, I'm undertaking a major initiative here, similar to yours, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, okay. So 4 things. I think 1, get started, and show real progress quickly, even if that means, dumb analytics. But, that I think is more powerful than anything else. It's just real results. I think 2 is being clear on how more sophistication, which let's be clear, as you get more ambitious and more sophisticated, it requires more investment. Mm-hmm. Be clear on how that unlocks new use cases. I think a lot of non-tech kind of business execs, what they really want is a dashboard. And sometimes they don't really understand why they need to be investing in a multi-million-dollar big data program to build a dashboard, and arguably they kind of don't, right? But if you feel as a chief data officer that it's really important that we build out that capability, be clear why. And often it's some advanced analytics use cases, or it's machine learning use cases, but really need to sort of tell that story. I've seen numerous times where, big data projects, the output of the big data project is a dashboard, and it's like, you could have done that 5 times quicker and 5 times, cheaper. Right. So I just think tying sophistication to business value. I think be pragmatic from an architectural perspective. I just, again, a lot of this new stuff, particularly mesh, is some of it can be quite prescriptive when you read it. But I think ultimately this stuff has to work. So just like I was talking about earlier, maybe we do end up with some data duplication, because it's the right way of managing access and security, and that's fine, as long as you sort of have some sort of rational basis for making those decisions. And then 4, like I said earlier, it's not a storage-led problem, right? In a complex organization, you got to understand really quickly whether or not, is it a storage problem? Might be, in which case, let's do it, and you're going to do really well. If it isn't, stop trying to fight it and focus on that orchestration and that automation side of it, to enable just enable that, control of all of that entropy across the estate, across clouds and across different systems. So that's it, really.
Awesome. Well, that was I find it to be an absolutely fascinating story, with lots of great learnings. Really, really appreciate the time you've taken to share your experiences. And I like the mental mappings around kind of theories and concepts to what actually works. And so this mapping that we haven't spent that much time on it back to kind of the current discussion around mesh is always fascinating for me. We do have time for one question, so let me grab the first one that came in. And the question is, what would you say was your biggest challenge going from P0 to P1, P1 being the metrics collection, KPI collection?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, again, I actually think it comes down to understanding the upstream data systems, right? And this is where I think actually having had one particularly very good sort of data analyst on my team who just knew how this stuff worked and just could because like, I think when you start, it's a good point. Like when you start showing numbers globally, you better make sure they're right. Because if they're not right, you're going to get, actually, if they're not right, you get questions back, you get noise, but more than anything, it just starts to undermine people's confidence in the fact that you know what you're doing. Right. So if we're going to be publishing numbers about, the health of our, like constituent businesses, it's got to be right. And what that means is it means you have to have the people on the team who understand how those systems work and what correct looks like. And that might not be the same person as, the Spark engineer. It might actually be the guy who's been working with Adobe Analytics for 15 years, right? But actually, if you don't realize that, you're just in danger of just never nailing it. And then as soon as it's correct, and as soon as you then hit a cadence and get into your stride of publishing correct data every day, every month, confidence grows, people get more interested in wanting to see the data, more people are asked to get access to it, and then it sort of goes from there, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Simon.
I think there's a couple, Tom, there's a couple of other questions, but in a different tab.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, sorry, I missed that one. I'm glad you saw those because we do have a few.
Yeah, it's in the cunningly titled Q&A tab.
Yeah. So I will, I think everybody can see it. I'll read it. How invested are you in assorted data observability technologies and approaches?
I would say intellectually very, it's one of our biggest focuses for this year. Yeah. Again, my perspective on this is, if you're setting yourself up again in a very sort of high visibility role, kind of at the nexus of information in a company, especially if you're dependent on your data you're dependent for your data on systems that you don't control, like it's vitally important that you know when stuff goes wrong before your customers find out that stuff goes wrong. Mm-hmm. And really that for me is really the essence of observability. So I think we get a lot of it. We get a lot of the raw telemetry from Ascend. I think we need to do more to have more intelligent sort of alerting and kind of around it, so that we oftentimes know that stuff went wrong, but that message didn't quite get to the right person in a timely manner.
Yeah.
Right? And so
kind of the instrumentation, the data seems to all be there in general. Right. And most of the times I'm not to put words in your mouth, but it feels like it's more the instrumentation of it. Well, finding out what is important and not, the instrumentation of said thing, and then the process to ingest and be able to do something about it in a timely manner.
Yeah, and it's a hard thing, we do have we have alerting sort of built in, and we monitor stats and we send alerts, but unless those alerts are really intelligently written, you can become blind to them, right? Because if you're getting like 3 a day, you just ignore them after a while, so you don't know what's important or not. And I think that's probably the interesting thing, that's the interesting incremental sort of piece of sophistication that I think we need to look at is making sure that we're notified when stuff really is wrong, rather than sort of, too many alerts, just we become blind. Yeah.
Cool. I would really love to touch on this last question because I think it's a fantastic topic. That we will absolutely pick up in another webinar, which gets to kind of recommendations around kind of team size and roles. I know there's limited stuff that you can expose yourself. If there's anything in the last minute or two, the audience with, and then we'll do a follow-up session on this.
Look, I think, for context, each of our 9 business units has, fully staffed tech and data teams. And, depending on the business unit, it could be, a dozen to hundreds of people working in data. So I think, globally, we have a community of sort of, many hundreds of practitioners in data. If we're then talking about specifically my team at the center, who's making sense of all of this and putting all of this in, have about 20 something people. And it's a mixture of engineers, analysts, data science, data product people, and data governance people. So probably in the context of the size of News Corp, very small. It's, to the point that it's being made in the question, it's a big, it's a big effort. I think it underscores for me the importance of smart technology choice. It underscores the importance of a strategy, again, that enables you to unlock business value, but without having to have 100 people, right? And growing into that sophistication as you unlock more investment. So we're growing this year. We'll be making the team big. That will allow us to do more stuff, but it's not a step function. It's not a big bang, nothing, and then a full capability. It's an on-ramp of sophistication.
And another maturity model. We will, Sergio, thanks for the question. We'll definitely be pulling together, whether it's content or a webinar on, especially the types of roles, to give folks a definition and understanding of at least some patterns we've seen with other companies, and kind of melding that into kind of one recommendation, if you will. So thanks again for the question. Thanks, Simon. That was fantastic again. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We'll have the recording up, and you'll probably get an email on it. I'm not sure how that's getting distributed, but hope to see you again in our next episode. Take care.
Excellent. Bye-bye.